Good evening, and welcome to Lamplight and Historian. I am Charles. Tonight we're following a country that did not exist for most of the story we're about to tell. If you look at a modern map, Germany seems fixed and familiar. One state in the center of Europe, with Berlin as its capital and borders that appear clean on the page. For centuries, almost none of that was true. The same space was once divided among tribal communities, duchies, bishoprics, kingdoms, free cities, and tiny principalities. People could speak related languages and share customs without sharing a ruler. They could live only a few days' journey apart and belong to completely different political worlds. So this is not a story of a nation steadily growing into its modern shape. It is a story of repeated attempts to answer a harder question. How do many different regions, rulers, churches, cities, and communities live under one political order? To find the first part of that answer, we have to go back before Berlin, before Prussia, before the Holy Roman Empire, and even before anyone living there would have called the land Germany. We begin with rivers, forests, and communities that left no continuous written history of their own. The earliest part of this history is difficult for a simple reason. There was no Germany, and there was no single German people in the modern sense. Across northern and central Europe, communities lived among forests, wetlands, river valleys, and open farmland. Their settlements were small, their political loyalties were local. A person was far more likely to identify with a family, clan, or tribe than with any larger Germanic identity. Archaeology gives us the first outline. Burial grounds, pottery, tools, weapons, jewelry, and traces of settlements show communities changing gradually through the late Bronze Age and Iron Age. There was no sudden moment when a clearly defined Germanic civilization appeared. What developed instead was a broad family of related cultures, spread across a large area and connected by language, exchange, and overlapping customs. The word Germanic can make that world sound more unified than it was. Greek and Roman writers eventually grouped many of these peoples together because they seemed to share linguistic and cultural features. But the people themselves belonged to communities with names and rivalries of their own. Later sources mention groups such as the Cherusci, Chatti, Suebi, Saxons, Franks, Alemanni, Goths, and many others. Those labels could shift over time. Coalitions formed, broke apart, and reappeared under new names. Their languages belonged to the Germanic branch of the wider Indo-European language family. Over centuries, those languages would separate into different forms and eventually contribute to modern German, Dutch, English, and the Scandinavian languages. But language did not create a common state. It was one thread among many. The landscape shaped daily life. Shorter growing seasons and extensive woodland meant that farming was often combined with animal husbandry, hunting, gathering, and local trade. People raised cattle and pigs, grew grains such as barley and wheat, used timber for building and fuel, and depended on nearby rivers and paths to move goods. Now focus on one object, amber from the Baltic coast. It was prized far to the south in the Mediterranean world. Amber moved through trading networks, while metal goods, glass beads, coins, wine containers, and other imported objects moved north. Those exchanges matter because they show that these communities were not sealed off from Europe. Long before Roman armies arrived, goods and ideas were already moving across the region. Political authority was personal. Free men could meet in assemblies to settle disputes or recognize leaders. A chieftain depended on reputation, military success, generosity, and the loyalty of followers. He did not command a permanent bureaucracy. If his standing weakened, his authority could weaken with it. That made politics flexible, but it also made larger unity difficult. Settlements themselves were changing as well. Iron tools became more common. Some communities cultivated the same fields for longer periods, instead of shifting as often. Longhouses could shelter people, supplies, and livestock through difficult seasons. None of this produced cities on the Roman scale, but it supported population growth and made local societies more stable. Stability, in turn, created more to defend: fields, herds, trading routes, and the standing of families within a community. Religion was equally varied. Sacred groves, springs, open spaces, and natural features could serve as places of worship. Later, Germanic and Norse traditions preserve memories of gods associated with war, fertility, weather, and fate, although historians have to be careful about projecting later Scandinavian beliefs backward onto every earlier community. The evidence is uneven, and much of it comes from people observing from outside. That is an important limitation. The Germanic peoples left no continuous written chronicle of these centuries. Roman authors later described them as brave, fiercely independent, and deeply attached to kinship and honor. Some of that may reflect real social values. Some of it also reflects Roman assumptions about people beyond the frontier. Archaeology often gives a quieter picture: longhouses, fields, graves, tools, livestock, and small communities adapting over generations. Competition between communities also mattered. A successful leader could attract warriors and allies. A weaker group could be absorbed, pushed aside, or forced to seek new land. Migration was often gradual rather than a single dramatic invasion. Families and clans could move over years or generations, changing the political map without leaving a clear written record of when the change began. By the final centuries before the Common Era, larger coalitions became easier to see. Germanic-speaking communities came into closer contact with Celtic peoples to the south and west. Sometimes they traded, sometimes they fought, sometimes groups moved into new territory. The boundaries between peoples were rarely neat. Then Rome entered the story. As Roman armies conquered Gaul during the 1st century BCE, the Rhine became more than a river. It became a political line between a growing Mediterranean empire and the many communities farther east. The line was never sealed. People crossed it, goods crossed it, and alliances crossed it. But from Rome's point of view, the lands beyond the Rhine had become a frontier. And once Rome had reached that frontier, one question became hard to avoid. If Gaul could be conquered, why not Germania? Once Roman power settled along the Rhine, the river became a frontier, but it was never a closed frontier. Merchants crossed it, soldiers crossed it, diplomats crossed it. Roman commanders learned which tribal leaders could be useful allies and which posed a threat. Germanic leaders, in turn, learned that Rome could provide money, military service, prestige, and protection against local rivals. Trade made the relationship visible. Roman wine, pottery, coins, metal tools, and luxury goods appeared in communities east of the river. Furs, cattle, amber, and other products moved toward Roman markets. Germanic warriors entered Roman service and learned the routines of the imperial army. Some members of elite families spent years inside the Roman world. That exchange created a strange frontier society in which the two sides were different, but increasingly familiar with one another. For Roman leaders, the lands beyond the Rhine also looked like an unfinished project. Gaul had been conquered. Augustus and his commanders could reasonably ask whether the empire should push farther east. Roman armies crossed the river repeatedly. Forts and supply lines appeared deeper inside Germania. Some communities submitted or negotiated. For a time, Roman officials behaved as though a new province might be taking shape. That is where the familiar story becomes deceptive. It is often told as Rome on one side and free Germanic tribes on the other. In reality, the frontier was full of people who had a foot in both worlds. Arminius was one of them. He belonged to the Cherusi, but he had received Roman military experience, obtained Roman citizenship, and served with Roman forces. He knew how Roman officers thought. He understood the discipline of the legions, but he also understood the terrain and political resentments east of the Rhine. The crisis came in 9 CE. Publius Quinctilius Varus was operating with Roman forces in territory that Rome increasingly treated as subject to imperial rule. Roman law, taxation, and administrative demands made that claim more concrete. For communities accustomed to local authority, this could feel less like an alliance and more like occupation. Arminius quietly built support among several Germanic groups. He did not try to defeat the legions in an open set peace battle. That would have played to Roman strengths. Instead, he used what the landscape offered: narrow routes, wooded country, difficult movement, and the confidence of commanders who believed the region was under control. Picture the Roman column not as a neat block of soldiers, but as a long-moving body of troops, baggage, animals, servants, and equipment. Once that column stretched out, Roman discipline was harder to use. Germanic fighters attacked from positions where the legions could not easily form the kind of battle line they preferred. The fighting continued for several days. Roman units tried to regroup. They could not restore cohesion. 3 legions were destroyed, Varus died, and the scale of the defeat shocked Augustus's government. A simple version of the story stops there. Rome lost and Germania remained free. The record is messier. Roman armies returned. Germanicus led major retaliatory campaigns. Roman forces won battles and recovered some of the lost standards. The empire still had the military capacity to cross the Rhine. The real question was not whether Rome could win another battle. It was whether permanent conquest was worth the cost. The answer gradually became no. Holding territory east of the Rhine would require troops, roads, forts, supplies, administrators, and constant political management. The economic return was uncertain. Local resistance remained difficult to suppress. Rome shifted from expansion to frontier control. That decision shaped the region for centuries. The Rhine and Danube became the main lines of Roman defense. Forts, roads, watchtowers, and other defensive works formed a broad frontier system, often associated with the limes. It was not an unbroken wall. Its purpose was to watch movement, protect settled territory, and control important routes. On the Roman side of that system, urban life expanded. Cologne, Mainz, Trier, Augsburg, Regensburg, and other centres grew within the Roman world. Roads linked military bases, markets, and administrative centres. Roman law, coinage, architecture, religion, and urban habits left deep marks across western and southern parts of what is now Germany. East and north of the frontier, communities developed differently. They were not isolated from Rome. Trade continued. Germanic soldiers still served in Roman armies. Leaders could receive Roman payments, titles, or gifts. Border communities adopted selected Roman goods and practices without becoming Roman provinces. Over the next centuries, the political names changed. Franks, Alemanni, Saxons, Goths, and other larger confederations became more prominent. These were not necessarily ancient tribes surviving unchanged. Many were new coalitions built from older groups under new pressures. And Rome itself was becoming harder to hold together. Civil wars, disputed successions, economic strain, and pressure on several frontiers stretched imperial resources. Germanic soldiers and commanders became increasingly important inside the Roman military system, which made the boundary between Roman and Germanic less tidy than later maps suggest. During the 4th and 5th centuries, population movements intensified across Europe. The arrival of the Huns from the Eurasian steppe pushed other groups westward. Goths entered Roman territory in large numbers. Vandals, Suebi, Burgundians, Franks, and others fought, negotiated, settled, and eventually ruled within lands that had once been governed from Rome. Here, another neat date can mislead us. The year 476 is often used as the end of the Western Roman Empire. It is useful as a marker, but everyday institutions did not vanish in one afternoon. Bishops still led church communities. Latin remained important. Cities survived. Local elites adjusted to new rulers. Among the groups that adapted most successfully were the Franks. They had long lived near the lower Rhine and had learned to combine warfare with selective cooperation with Roman power. Some served as federated allies. Others expanded independently into northern Gaul. By the late 5th century, a Frankish ruler named Clovis began bringing several Frankish groups under his authority and defeating neighbouring rulers. His kingdom expanded across much of Gaul and connected lands on both sides of the old Roman frontier. Clovis then made a religious choice with political consequences. He adopted the form of Christianity followed by the Roman Church and much of the Gallo-Roman population. Several other Germanic kingdoms followed Arian Christianity, which Nicene church leaders regarded as heretical. Clovis's conversion brought him closer to bishops and local elites who possessed literacy, land, administrative experience, and influence. The Frankish kingdom became a bridge between two eras. It preserved parts of the Roman world while adapting them to Germanic kingship. The Rhine was no longer the boundary of an empire. It now ran through a Christian kingdom that stretched across regions, later associated with both France and Germany. That kingdom was still not Germany, but from it would come the first political structure that can be connected directly to the medieval German story. Clovis's Merovingian dynasty did not remain equally powerful. Over time, much of the practical work of ruling passed to senior officials, known as mayors of the palace. One family of these officials became dominant. They are remembered as the Carolingians. Charles Martel strengthened the family's military position in the 8th century. His son, Pepin the Short, went further. With papal support, Pepin removed the last Merovingian king and took the royal title himself. That alliance between Frankish monarchy and the Church of Rome would matter long after Pepin was gone. His son was Charlemagne, or Karl the Gross. He became king of the Franks in 768 and spent much of his reign expanding his authority across Western and Central Europe. His realm eventually included most of present-day France, large areas of Germany, northern and central Italy, the Low Countries and territories farther east. For the future German lands, the long war against the Saxons was especially important. The Saxons occupied a broad region in the north and resisted Frankish conquest for decades. This was not simply a contest over a border. Charlemagne wanted political submission and Christian conversion. Conquest and religion became part of the same project. The campaigns were harsh and prolonged. Eventually, Saxony was incorporated into the Frankish realm. Bavaria and other regions were brought under firmer Carolingian control as well. Lands once governed through separate tribal and regional structures were now connected to a much larger kingdom. But look closely at how that kingdom worked. Charlemagne did not sit in a permanent capital and issue instructions through a modern civil service. He travelled. He relied on counts, bishops, abbots, local elites, and trusted agents. Royal messengers inspected administration. Assemblies brought powerful men into contact with the court. Government depended on movement and personal presence. The church was central to that system. Monasteries and cathedral schools trained clergy and preserved literacy. Charlemagne supported the copying of books and improvements in education. Scholars gathered around his court, and a clearer style of Latin handwriting spread widely. Later historians called this the Carolingian Renaissance. The name can sound grander than the everyday reality. Most people remained rural, and most could not read. The importance of the reforms lay elsewhere. They strengthened clerical administration, preserved texts, and created more consistent ways of communicating across a large realm. Then came the image that later generations remembered. On Christmas Day in the year 800, Pope Leo III crowned Charlemagne emperor in Rome. The ceremony revived an imperial title in Western Europe centuries after the collapse of the old Western Roman court. Charlemagne was not rebuilding ancient Rome. His institutions, economy, and political centre were different. Yet the crown linked Frankish kingship to the prestige of Rome and to a larger Christian idea of empire. It is tempting to see that moment as the beginning of Germany. It was not. Charlemagne's realm was far larger and more diverse, and its political centre did not belong to a German nation state that did not yet exist. The real turning point came after his death. Charlemagne died in 814. His son Louis the Pious inherited the empire, but Louis's own sons fought over the succession. The political system had been built around a ruling family, and that created a structural problem. Several heirs could claim a share of the same realm. In 843, the Treaty of Verdun divided the Carolingian Empire into three main parts. The Western Kingdom moved toward the political world that would become France. A central kingdom ran from the North Sea toward Italy. The Eastern Kingdom, East Francia, covered much of the territory that would later form the core of medieval Germany. Even here, the label Germany would be premature. East Francia contained large regional duchies, such as Saxony, Bavaria, Franconia, and Swabia. Each had its own aristocratic networks, interests, and traditions. People spoke related Germanic dialects, but political loyalty remained strongly regional. As Carolingian authority weakened, those regional rulers gained room to act. The eastern branch of the dynasty eventually died out, creating a question that would shape German politics for centuries. If there was no obvious hereditary king, how should a new one be chosen? The answer became increasingly elective. Powerful nobles and dukes expected a voice in recognizing the ruler. A king needed ancestry, but ancestry alone was not enough. He also needed support from men who controlled territories, armies, churches, and local networks. Henry the Fowler, Duke of Saxony, became king in the early 10th century. He focused on stabilizing East Francia and defending it, especially against Magyar raids from the east. He strengthened fortifications and worked with regional dukes, rather than trying to erase their authority. His son Otto I succeeded him in 936. Otto tried to strengthen the monarchy while still depending on cooperation. Bishops and abbots became important partners because church offices were not legally hereditary. A king could hope to use those offices without creating another dynasty that would pass the same position from father to son. That strategy had limits. Otto faced rebellions from nobles and members of his own family. The pattern is worth noticing. A medieval German king could be powerful, but he could not rule alone. In 955, Otto defeated a major Magyar force at the Battle of Lechfeld near Augsburg. The victory increased his prestige and helped secure the eastern frontier. He later intervened in Italy, and in 962 the Pope crowned him emperor. From that point, the kings of the German lands became closely tied to an imperial tradition that reached south toward Rome and Italy. Historians would later call the political structure that grew from this tradition the Holy Roman Empire. The name sounds more unified than the reality. What followed was not a centralized state. It was an empire held together by negotiation among rulers who all possessed power of their own. The Holy Roman Empire is easy to misunderstand if we judge it by the standards of a modern state. It had an emperor, but no single capital that governed everything. It had laws, but many territories also had laws and privileges of their own. It had borders, but authority inside those borders overlapped. A better way to picture it is as a layered political order. Duchies, counties, bishoprics, abbeys, kingdoms, free cities, and smaller lordships all existed beneath the imperial framework. The emperor stood at the top in prestige, but his power was never absolute. He had to bargain with the people and institutions that already controlled land, money, courts, soldiers, and local loyalties. That sounds like a weakness. Sometimes it was. But it also helps explain why the empire lasted for centuries. Powerful dukes governed large territories. Bishops and abbots held estates and political rights. Counts and local lords administered justice. Towns negotiated charters that could give them control over markets, tolls, defences, and local government. The emperor worked through these authorities rather than replacing them. Distance made the arrangement even more important. The empire stretched from the North Sea toward the Alps and included regions separated by mountains, forests, and long travel times. Messages moved at the speed of a rider. A ruler who wanted to be taken seriously had to travel, appear in person, hold assemblies, confirm privileges, settle disputes, and reward supporters. When emperors were strong, they could influence appointments and shape major decisions. When they were weak, absent, or distracted by Italy, regional rulers gained room to act. That constant negotiation became one of the defining features of medieval German politics. The church was one of the emperor's most useful partners. Bishops were often educated, controlled large estates, and had administrative experience. Kings therefore wanted influence over who became a bishop. Church reformers increasingly objected. To them, spiritual office should not be handed out as an instrument of royal government. This dispute became the investiture controversy. Beneath the religious language was a very practical question. Who got to place a powerful bishop in office, the emperor or the church? Emperor Henry IV and Pope Gregory VII became its most famous opponents. Henry believed that control over important bishops was essential to government. Gregory insisted that the church had to be free from secular interference. The dispute escalated until Gregory excommunicated Henry. Now narrow the scene to one journey. In 1077, Henry crossed the Alps and went to Canossa, where Gregory was staying. He sought absolution and received it. Later, generations turned the episode into a simple image of an emperor humiliated before a pope. But the political result was less tidy. Henry recovered enough standing to continue the struggle. Canossa solved an immediate problem. It did not settle the argument. The conflict continued until the Concordat of Worms in 1122 created a compromise. The Church controlled the spiritual appointment of bishops. While the emperor retained a political role, neither side received everything it wanted. That outcome tells us something larger about the empire. Authority rarely moved through one clean chain of command. It overlapped secular rulers. Church leaders, towns, princes, monasteries, and local communities all held rights that had to be negotiated. While emperors and popes argued, the society beneath them was changing. Population grew during much of the High Middle Ages. Forests were cleared. New villages appeared. Agriculture expanded. The heavy plough and crop rotation improved cultivation in some regions. More productive land could support more people, and those people did not all remain in the countryside. Towns grew, and with them came another source of political power. Cologne, Mainz, Frankfurt, Nuremberg, Augsburg, Regensburg, and many other cities became centers of trade and craftsmanship. Merchants formed associations, craftsmen organized guilds, markets connected river routes and overland roads. A city charter could change what local life looked like. It might grant the right to hold a market, collect tolls, build defenses, or govern through a council. Some towns eventually became free imperial cities, answerable directly to the emperor rather than to a nearby territorial prince. Think about what that meant on the ground. A wealthy merchant city could negotiate with nobles. A bishop could rule land as a prince. A monastery could own villages and farmland. A duke could raise forces. The emperor remained the highest figure in theory, but everyday government was spread across many hands. In the north, cities developed a commercial network that reached across the Baltic and North Seas. The Hanseatic League linked places such as Lübeck, Hamburg, and Bremen with trading communities abroad. Hanseatic merchants sought privileges, protected routes, and moved goods between Northern Europe, Scandinavia, England, the Baltic, and farther east. The League was not a state. It had no single permanent government. Its strength came from cities cooperating when their interests matched. That arrangement, too, fits the wider pattern of the empire: limited central control, but dense networks of trade, law, custom, and mutual advantage. German-speaking settlement also expanded eastward during the Middle Ages. Princes, bishops, monasteries, and military orders encouraged farmers and townspeople to settle in regions inhabited by Slavic and Baltic peoples. Historians often call this process the Aussiedlung. It unfolded over generations and looked different from place to place. In some areas, local rulers encouraged settlement for economic reasons. In others, settlement accompanied conquest or political pressure. The result was not a simple eastward line of one people replacing another. It was a broad and changing zone of mixed languages, legal systems, towns, villages, and political authority across Central and Eastern Europe. Meanwhile, emperors kept being drawn south into Italy. The imperial title itself encouraged involvement there, and the cities of northern Italy were too wealthy and important to ignore. But every campaign across the Alps had a cost. Time and resources spent in Italy gave German princes more room at home. Frederick, known as Barbarossa, spent much of his reign trying to strengthen imperial authority in both Germany and Italy. He achieved enormous prestige, yet northern Italian cities resisted efforts to reduce their independence. His reign showed the same limit that earlier emperors had faced. Military power could win a campaign, but it could not permanently remove every competing centre of authority. His grandson Frederick II inherited an even more complicated realm, with interests in Germany and Sicily. He became famous for his learning and for repeated conflicts with the papacy. Because so much of his attention remained in the Mediterranean, princes in the German lands secured more privileges. By the later Middle Ages, the monarchy was unmistakably elective. A small group of leading princes acquired a recognized role in choosing the king. The Golden Bull of 1356 formalized the position of these princes, electors, and gave the empire a more defined procedure for succession. Again, what looks like fragmentation was not simply political failure. It made centralization difficult, but it also allowed regional courts, towns, universities, churches, and legal traditions to develop with considerable independence. Then a new technology arrived that made those local worlds much harder to keep intellectually separate. In 15th century Mainz, Johannes Gutenberg helped develop a practical system of printing with movable metal type. Books and pamphlets could be reproduced faster and in far greater numbers than handwritten copies. The change was not instant, and literacy did not suddenly become universal, but the speed and scale of copying had changed. For the next great crisis in German history, that mattered more than any emperor could have known, the object to watch was no longer a crown or a sword. It was a printed page. By the early 16th century, the Holy Roman Empire was politically fragmented, but still formally part of Western Christendom. The Church touched almost every level of life. It shaped education, ritual, charity, marriage, law, and the calendar. Bishops could be political rulers, as well as religious leaders. Monasteries owned land. The papacy stood at the center of a system that reached into towns and villages across the empire. Criticism was not new. Reformers had complained for generations about clerical wealth, corruption, the sale of offices, and the distance between church teaching and everyday practice. Humanist scholars were returning to older texts and asking uncomfortable questions. What changed in the 16th century was not simply the existence of criticism. It was the speed at which criticism could travel. Martin Luther entered that dispute in Saxony. He was an Augustinian monk and a university teacher in Wittenberg. His early concern was theological. How could a person receive salvation? He became increasingly critical of the sale of indulgences, which promised reductions in the temporal penalties associated with sin and were being used to raise money. In 1517, Luther circulated the arguments later known as the 95 Theses. They were meant for scholarly debate. Printing gave them a different life. That distinction matters. The familiar image is one man confronting an entire church. The evidence in the story points to something broader: a reformer, a printing network, sympathetic readers, protective princes, and an imperial system that could not enforce one decision everywhere at once. Copies spread through the German lands and beyond. The argument quickly moved past indulgences. Luther challenged papal authority and insisted on the central place of Scripture. He argued that salvation came through faith. Different audiences heard different things in his message. For some, the appeal was religious. They believed the church required reform and found Luther's theology convincing. For some territorial rulers, reform also offered political advantages. A prince who supported the new movement could reduce outside ecclesiastical influence and gain more control over church institutions and property inside his own territory. Townspeople and educated readers entered debates that had once been more confined to clergy and universities. Emperor Charles V condemned Luther at the Diet of Worms in 1521. But an imperial order was not the same thing as effective enforcement. The empire was decentralized. Frederick the Wise of Saxony protected Luther, and the reformer continued to write and translate. The printed page now did something that earlier reform movements had struggled to do. It kept the argument moving even when authorities tried to contain it. Luther's German translation of the Bible became one of the major cultural products of the Reformation. It did not create the German language. Written and spoken forms already existed across the region, but its wide circulation helped strengthen common patterns of written German and made Scripture accessible to a broader reading public. Reform also moved beyond Luther. Other theologians developed different positions. Cities changed worship and church administration. Clergy married. Monasteries closed in some territories. Church property changed hands. Preaching and scripture became more central in Protestant worship. Then, the religious crisis collided with older social grievances. In the 1520s, peasants and rural communities in parts of the empire rose in revolt. Their complaints included economic burdens, legal restrictions, and demands for traditional rights. Some used the language of religious reform to support those demands. Luther criticized abuses by rulers, but he condemned the revolt and supported the restoration of order. The Peasants' War was defeated with great violence. That outcome exposed a limit that is easy to miss if the Reformation is told only as a story of religious liberation. Reform did not automatically mean political equality. It could weaken one hierarchy while leaving others in place. Over the following decades, the empire divided into Catholic and Protestant territories. The division reached far beyond church services. A ruler's confession could shape schools, marriage law, local administration, clergy, public ritual, and the education of children. The Peace of Augsburg in 1555 reduced immediate conflict by recognizing Lutheranism and allowing rulers to determine the official confession of their territories. It was a workable compromise, but not a complete one. Calvinism was not fully included. Mixed communities remained mixed. Rulers changed policy. Minorities moved across borders. Catholic reform strengthened its own schools and institutions while Protestant governments built theirs. Printing continued to widen the argument. Pamphlets, sermons, songs, and polemics reached markets, workshops, homes, universities, and town councils. Religion was no longer only a theological question. It had become part of territorial government and political loyalty. By the early 17th century, Protestant and Catholic rulers were organizing into competing alliances. The empire had survived a century of reform through negotiation, but the compromise had not removed the underlying problem. Religious division now sat on top of rival dynasties, territorial ambitions, and an emperor who still wanted greater cohesion. The next crisis began in Bohemia. It started with a dispute over religious and political rights. Very quickly, it became something much larger. The 30 Years' War began in Bohemia, one of the Habsburg lands inside the wider imperial system. Bohemia had a long history of religious complexity, and many Protestant nobles feared that the Habsburg monarchy intended to narrow their rights. In 1618, that argument became open rebellion. Representatives of the Bohemian estates confronted imperial officials in Prague and threw several of them from a castle window. The episode became famous as the defenestration of Prague. The officials survived. The political relationship did not. The Bohemian rebels rejected Habsburg authority and chose another king. Emperor Ferdinand II responded in defense of both his dynasty and Catholic rule. At first, the conflict still looked regional. Then other powers began to calculate what a Habsburg victory might mean for them. The early fighting favored the emperor. Bohemian forces were defeated at White Mountain in 1620. The revolt was crushed, Protestant nobles lost property, and Catholic authority was strengthened. But White Mountain ended the rebellion, not the war. Other Protestant rulers feared a stronger Habsburg position inside the empire. Denmark intervened. Sweden later entered under Gustavus Adolphus. Then France, a Catholic kingdom, supported Habsburg enemies because French policy cared more about the European balance of power than about a simple Catholic versus Protestant divide. That is the point where the usual label becomes inadequate. The 30 Years' War began in a confessional crisis, but it did not remain a purely religious war. Dynastic rivalry, territory, security, and the balance between European powers pulled the conflict in new directions. For people living in the German lands, those strategic distinctions could feel very distant. An army still had to eat. Troops needed food, horses, shelter, and money. Governments often could not supply everything directly, so armies took resources from the territories they crossed. Towns and villages were ordered to provide cash or provisions. When they could not, property could be seized. Battle was only one part of the destruction. Crops were ruined, trade was interrupted, disease spread, families were displaced. Some regions lost a very large share of their population. Although the damage varied sharply from one place to another, that variation matters. There was no single German experience of the war. Some cities and territories recovered relatively quickly. Others needed generations. The conflict moved, stopped, returned, and moved again. A village could escape one campaign and suffer badly in the next. The war also exposed a political problem inside the empire. The emperor could raise armies and build coalitions, but he could not impose a permanent settlement on hundreds of rulers whose interests were not the same. Albrecht von Wallenstein showed both the opportunity and the danger. He built a large army for the emperor and became enormously powerful. His military usefulness made him difficult to ignore, His independence made him politically threatening. He was eventually removed and killed on imperial orders. Swedish intervention shifted the military balance. Gustavus Adolphus won major victories and became a central Protestant figure before dying in battle. Sweden stayed in the war. France later entered more directly. By then, some of the original religious issues were no longer driving every decision. By the 1640s, exhaustion was everywhere and decisive victory was nowhere. Diplomats met in Munster and Osnabrück, while armies continued fighting elsewhere. Negotiation and warfare ran in parallel until the Peace of Westphalia was concluded in 1648. The settlement did more than stop the fighting. It confirmed the legal standing of several Christian confessions and strengthened the rights of territorial rulers. Princes gained broad authority within their states and could conduct foreign relations within limits. The emperor remained the symbolic head of the empire, but the prospect of turning it into a tightly centralized monarchy became even more remote. Westphalia also reflected a wider European settlement. France and Sweden gained influence. The Dutch Republic and Switzerland received formal recognition of independence from the empire. On the German map, fragmentation remained. Large territories sat beside tiny ones. Church lands bordered secular principalities. Imperial cities stood among noble estates. Then came the slower work, repairing walls, reopening markets, restoring farms, rebuilding workshops, and repopulating damaged districts. Some rulers encouraged immigration. Administrations tried to become more reliable. Standing armies became more important, partly because rulers did not want to depend on the kind of improvised military systems that had devastated the countryside. Out of that post-war rebuilding, two powers began to matter more than the others. The Habsburg monarchy remained the most prestigious German-speaking power and continued to hold the imperial title. Farther north, the Hohenzollerns ruled a scattered collection of territories centered on Brandenburg and Prussia. The old empire would survive for more than another century. But increasingly, the political future of the German world would be shaped by the rivalry between these two states. After the 30 Years' War, the Habsburg monarchy still carried the greatest prestige in the German-speaking world. Its rulers usually held the imperial title, but their own hereditary lands extended far beyond the core German territories. Austria, Bohemia, Hungary, and other regions formed a composite monarchy held together by dynasty, not by one national identity. That scale gave the Habsburgs strength, but it also gave them problems. Their rulers faced threats on several frontiers, including long conflict with the Ottoman Empire. Raising armies and taxes across such varied lands pushed the monarchy towards stronger administration. Far to the north, another state was solving a different problem. The Hohenzollerns ruled territories that did not form one neat block on the map. Brandenburg lay inside the Holy Roman Empire. Prussian lands stretched eastward along the Baltic. Distance made coordination difficult, and that difficulty encouraged rulers to build institutions that could move money, orders, and soldiers across separated possessions. Frederick William, the Great Elector, strengthened a permanent army and a more centralized system of taxation after the 30 Years' War. Provincial estates and local elites resisted parts of the program, but the monarchy gradually increased its control. This is where the usual image of Prussia begins: uniforms, drilling, discipline. But the army was only the visible part. Behind it stood taxation, bureaucracy, landowners, and a crown learning how to mobilize limited resources more efficiently. The Junker nobility of the eastern provinces kept substantial social power. In return, many served as officers and cooperated with the monarchy. The arrangement did not erase the old elite. It tied that elite more closely to the state. In 1701, Frederick III adopted the title King in Prussia and became Frederick I. The wording reflected the complicated legal position of Prussian lands inside and outside the empire, but the political message was clear enough. The Hohenzollern dynasty was claiming a higher place among European rulers. His successors continued the same work. Frederick William I became known for close attention to administration, military organization, and state finances. Prussia was not the richest European power, yet it became unusually capable of directing the resources it had. Then Frederick II took the throne in 1740. Frederick, later called Frederick the Great, admired Enlightenment thinkers and corresponded with leading intellectuals. He also believed firmly in dynastic power and in using the state when opportunity appeared. Soon after becoming king, he invaded Silesia, a prosperous Habsburg province. That decision changed the balance inside the German world. The struggle with Maria Theresa of Austria continued through the War of the Austrian Succession, and later the 7 Years' War. Prussia survived against powerful enemies and held Silesia. A state once seen as secondary now stood beside Austria as a major European power. Historians often describe the result as an Austrian-Prussian dualism. Both belonged to the imperial world, but both increasingly pursued interests larger than the empire's old institutions. Austria remained the bigger and more diverse monarchy, deeply involved in Central and Southeastern Europe. Prussia developed a reputation for disciplined administration and military strength. Neither state was modern or democratic in the later sense, but both were reaching more deeply into the lives of their subjects. Enlightenment ideas influenced that process. Frederick encouraged a degree of religious toleration, invited settlers to underpopulated areas, supported agriculture, and patronized cultural life. Habsburg rulers such as Maria Theresa and Joseph II also pursued administrative and educational reforms. These programs were not designed to transfer power to the population. They were designed to make monarchy work better. Census taking, taxation, schooling, legal regulation, and bureaucracy became more systematic. The state was becoming more present in everyday life. Economic development remained uneven. Some territories were overwhelmingly agricultural. Others developed mining, textiles, manufacturing, and commercial centers. Hamburg and northern ports connected German trade to wider markets. Saxony became important for textiles and crafts. Mining regions produced metals and coal. Better roads and postal systems shortened the practical distance between courts and cities. Political fragmentation also produced an unexpected cultural pattern. There was no single German capital dominating intellectual life. Courts and cities competed for musicians, architects, writers, professors, and prestige. Cultural activity spread across many centers. That helped language and shared culture acquire a new kind of importance. Writers and scholars discussed what German-speaking peoples might have in common, even when they lived under different rulers. But culture was still not a political program. Bavaria, Saxony, Württemberg, Prussia, Austria, and the Free Cities were real governments. Germany remained an idea with no obvious machinery for becoming a state. By the late 18th century, the Holy Roman Empire could still look durable. It had survived religious division, dynastic wars, and the rise of Prussia. Then, in 1789, revolution broke out in France. Its language of citizenship, rights, and popular sovereignty challenged hereditary monarchy. French armies soon crossed the Rhine, and under Napoleon Bonaparte, arrangements that had taken centuries to accumulate would be dismantled in a matter of years. The French Revolution began inside France, but its effects moved quickly across Europe. Monarchies watched the destruction of old privileges with alarm. Reformers elsewhere watched the language of citizenship, legal equality, and popular sovereignty with interest. In the German lands, those ideas arrived alongside something much harder to ignore: war. Austria, Prussia, and other monarchies fought revolutionary France. French armies crossed the Rhine, occupied territories, and redrew borders. Church lands were secularized. Small principalities disappeared or were absorbed. Arrangements that had grown slowly through medieval negotiation were suddenly treated as pieces on a political map. Napoleon Bonaparte accelerated everything. By the opening years of the 19th century, his victories over Austria, Prussia, and other states gave him enormous influence over Central Europe. Hundreds of small territories were consolidated. Some rulers lost their independence. Others gained land because they had aligned themselves with France. Then, in 1806, the old imperial framework finally broke. Several German states joined Napoleon's Confederation of the Rhine. Francis II concluded that the Holy Roman Empire could no longer function and laid down the imperial crown. An institution that had linked German kings, Roman imperial tradition. Bishops, princes, and cities for more than 8 centuries was gone. For many ordinary people, the next morning did not look dramatically different. Fields still had to be worked, taxes still had to be paid, local officials still appeared, but the legal roof over hundreds of territories had disappeared. Napoleonic rule carried a contradiction that later German politics would struggle to separate. French power brought reform and foreign domination at the same time. In territories influenced by France, legal systems were simplified. Some inherited privileges were reduced. The Napoleonic Code introduced principles of equality before the law. Feudal obligations were weakened or abolished in some places. Administrations were reorganized. But reform came with soldiers, taxes, requisitions, and economic disruption. States were expected to provide men and money for Napoleon's wars. Young men could be sent to fight far from home. The continental system interfered with trade. Modernization did not arrive as a neutral gift. It arrived under the authority of a foreign emperor. Prussia felt the shock especially hard. Its army, long associated with efficiency and discipline, was badly defeated at Jena and Auerstedt in 1806. The loss exposed weaknesses beneath Prussia's military reputation. Officials could no longer assume that the old system was good enough. The response was reform. Military organization changed. Administration was reconsidered. Serfdom and restrictions on economic activity were reduced in important ways. Education was reorganized, including the creation of the University of Berlin. The goal was not liberal democracy. The monarchy wanted a stronger state. Still, the reforms had consequences beyond that goal. They opened expectations that the restored governments would later find difficult to close again. At the same time, resistance to French domination encouraged a stronger language of German nationalism. Writers, students, intellectuals, and some political leaders spoke of a shared culture that reached beyond individual principalities. Language, literature, history, and memories of resistance became material for imagining a larger community. That nationalism was still limited. Most people remained attached to local states and regions. Austria and Prussia were very different political systems. Catholics and Protestants did not experience the same world. A shared language did not erase those divisions. What the wars did provide was a common political reference point. After Napoleon's invasion of Russia failed in 1812, his position weakened. Prussia joined Russia, Austria, and other powers in a new coalition. In 1813, the Battle of Leipzig brought enormous armies into Central Europe and ended in a major French defeat. Napoleon was eventually forced to abdicate, returned briefly during the 100 Days, and was defeated again at Waterloo in 1815. European leaders then met at Vienna to rebuild order. They restored many dynasties, but they did not restore the Holy Roman Empire. Instead, 39 German states were joined in a loose German confederation. Austria presided over its federal assembly. Prussia remained the other major German power. The arrangement was deliberately weak. Its purpose was stability, not national unity, but the Napoleonic years had already changed the terms of the debate. Old borders had vanished. Legal reforms had altered institutions. Economic ties were growing. Students and intellectuals had begun to speak of a German political community. Restoration could put rulers back on thrones. It could not make those questions disappear. What did it mean to be German? Should there be one state? And if there were, would Austria lead it? Would Prussia lead it? Or would neither be able to impose its answer? The German Confederation created after Napoleon's defeat was weak by design. Its member states kept their own rulers, armies, laws, and administrations. Austria presided over the Federal Assembly in Frankfurt, but there was no central government capable of directing political life across the whole confederation. To conservative leaders, that was a feature, not a flaw. Prince Clemens von Metternich of Austria believed nationalism and liberal constitutionalism threatened the European order restored after 1815. Governments watched universities, newspapers, political clubs, and student groups. The Carlsbad decrees of 1819 tightened censorship and restricted student activism. Political organization could be constrained. Social change was harder to stop. The population grew, towns expanded, literacy increased. Newspapers and pamphlets reached wider audiences. Then railways began to connect places that had once been separated by slow roads and long journeys. A railway line was not a constitution, but it could change how a political border felt. Economic integration moved faster than political integration. Prussia played a central role through the Zollverein, a customs union that gradually included many German states. Internal tariffs were reduced. Goods could move more easily across borders that still existed politically. Austria remained outside. The Zollverein did not create Germany. It did something subtler. It made cooperation visible and strengthened Prussia's economic influence at the same time. Industrialization added another layer. Coal mining expanded in the Ruhr. Iron production increased. Textile factories developed. Railways created demand for steel, machinery, investment, and skilled labor. New industrial towns drew workers from rural areas. The change was uneven. Much of the population still worked in agriculture, and older social hierarchies remained powerful. But new groups were becoming harder to ignore: factory workers, engineers, entrepreneurs, clerks, and a larger middle class. Political demands grew out of that changing society. Liberals wanted constitutions, representative government, civil rights, and limits on arbitrary rule. Nationalists wanted a stronger German union. Some people wanted both. The difficulty was the map. Would a united Germany include Austria? If it did, how would a German national state incorporate the Habsburg monarchy's many non-German territories? If Austria stayed outside, Prussia would almost certainly become the leading power. There was no agreed answer when revolution spread across Europe in 1848. Economic hardship, political frustration, and news from France brought demonstrations to many German cities. Protesters demanded constitutions, freedom of the press, representative institutions, and national unity. Rulers initially made concessions. In Berlin, demonstrations led to violent clashes, and King Frederick William IV promised reforms, while speaking cautiously in the language of German unity. Elections were organized for a national assembly. The Frankfurt Parliament met in St. Paul's Church. Pause on that setting for a moment. The attempt to build a German nation was being made by debate, speeches, committees, and a written constitution. The delegates were largely educated professionals: lawyers, professors, officials, and members of the middle class. They debated civil rights, executive power, monarchy, parliament, and the borders of the proposed state. The Austrian question again divided them. Eventually, the assembly chose a lesser German solution that excluded Austria and placed Prussia at the centre. It offered the imperial crown to Frederick William IV. He refused. That short answer exposed the central weakness of the project. The parliament could draft a constitution. It could not command the army or force the major monarchies to accept it. By 1849, the revolutionary movement had largely been defeated. Conservative governments regained control. Radical uprisings were suppressed, and many activists left the German states, including thousands who later settled in the United States. So did 1848 fail? Politically, yes, the parliament did not create a state, but the failure clarified the problem. It produced a constitutional language, national symbols, and a public argument about what German unity should look like. It also revealed something more uncomfortable. Ideas alone would not settle the question if the existing states kept control of armies, taxation, and administration. After 1848, railways kept expanding. Coal and steel production kept growing. Cities kept getting larger. Austria still led the Confederation. Prussia still possessed the strongest German state outside Austria. The next attempt at unity would not begin with professors debating in a church. It would begin inside the Prussian government, with an argument over the army budget. Otto von Bismarck came from the Prussian landed elite. He entered politics as a defender of monarchy and conservative authority, not as a liberal nationalist. He distrusted parliamentary government and believed Prussia, rather than a popular assembly, should decide the future of Germany. In 1862, King Wilhelm I appointed him minister, president during a constitutional conflict over military reform. The government wanted to enlarge and reorganize the Prussian army. Liberal deputies resisted the budget. Bismarck's answer was to keep governing and collecting taxes despite the dispute. This is usually where the phrase blood and iron enters the story. It is memorable, but it can also distort what Bismarck actually did. War mattered. So did diplomacy, timing, administration, railways, and the ability to keep potential enemies apart, long enough for Prussia to fight one at a time. The first crisis came over Schleswig and Holstein, two duchies linked to the Danish monarchy and also tied to the German political world. In 1864, Prussia and Austria fought Denmark together and won. The victory created an awkward arrangement. The two rival German powers now had to administer the duchies together. Bismarck used disputes over that arrangement as part of a larger confrontation with Austria. In 1866, war broke out between the two powers. It was brief. Prussia's reorganized army, mobilization system, railways, and command structure gave it important advantages. At Königgrätz, Prussian forces won a decisive victory. Then Bismarck made a choice that mattered almost as much as the battle. He argued against a settlement designed to humiliate Austria completely. He wanted Austria out of German political affairs. He did not want to create a permanent enemy by occupying Vienna or breaking the Habsburg monarchy apart. Austria was excluded from the German federal system. The old German Confederation disappeared. In the north, Prussia created the North German Confederation under a new federal structure dominated by Berlin. Southern states such as Bavaria, Württemberg, and Baden remained outside, although military agreements linked them to Prussia. At this point, the German question had changed. Before 1866, the central issue was whether Austria or Prussia would lead. After 1866, Austria was largely outside the process. The remaining problem was how the southern states would be brought in. The answer came through a crisis with France. Relations between France and Prussia deteriorated over the European balance of power and a dispute involving the Spanish throne. Bismarck edited and released the MS Dispatch in a form that sharpened public anger on both sides. France declared war on Prussia in 1870. Under their military agreements, the southern German states joined Prussia. German armies moved quickly. French forces suffered major defeats, and Napoleon III was captured at Sedan. Fighting continued after the French imperial government fell, but the direction of the war became clear. Then came a scene loaded with symbolism. In January 1871, while the war was still underway, German princes gathered in the Palace of Versailles outside Paris. There, Wilhelm I of Prussia was proclaimed German emperor. The state that the Frankfurt Parliament had failed to create by constitutional debate now existed, but it had been created under Prussian military and dynastic leadership. That difference shaped the new empire. Germany was federal, not fully centralized. Bavaria and other states kept important rights. Kings, dukes, and princes continued to rule their territories beneath the imperial structure. Prussia dominated the system. It contained most of the empire's land and population. The Prussian king was also the German emperor. Bismarck served as both Prussian minister, president, and imperial chancellor. The constitution included a Reichstag, elected by universal male suffrage. Yet the government was not fully responsible to Parliament. The Chancellor answered primarily to the Emperor, while the Federal Council, representing the states, also held important power. This was a modern national state with elections, but also a monarchy in which older elites remained deeply embedded. After 1871, Bismarck's problem reversed. Before unification, controlled conflict had helped Prussia change the map. Now another major European war could endanger everything he had built. His foreign policy therefore focused on preserving the settlement, isolating France, and maintaining workable relations with Austria, Hungary, and Russia. Inside Germany, stability was harder to manufacture. The first major confrontation involved the Catholic Church. Bismarck and liberal allies feared that Catholic political organization might create loyalties outside the empire. The Kulturkampf increased state pressure over church affairs. Catholic resistance proved durable, and the policy was eventually moderated. The growing socialist movement posed a different problem. Industrialization was producing a large urban working class, and socialist parties gained support by demanding political and economic reform. Bismarck tried two strategies at once. He supported restrictions on socialist organizations while also introducing social insurance. health insurance, accident insurance, and old age provisions were intended in part to weaken revolutionary appeal. They also became early foundations of the German welfare state. The empire that emerged under Bismarck was therefore more complicated than a military monarchy. It had mass elections, political parties, social reform, powerful regional identities, an industrial economy, and persistent tension between old elites and new social groups. In 1888, Wilhelm I died. After the brief reign of Frederick III, the young Wilhelm II became emperor. He and Bismarck disagreed over domestic politics, foreign policy, and how much power the chancellor should exercise. In 1890, Bismarck was forced to resign. The man who had used a carefully controlled series of crises to create the empire was gone. The state remained, and it was entering an era in which industry, science, cities, and international ambition would grow faster than the political system's ability to keep every tension under control. The German Empire entered the last decades of the 19th century with extraordinary economic momentum. Industrialization had started before unification, but the new national market, expanding railways, technical education, and access to coal and iron accelerated the process. The Ruhr became one of Europe's great industrial regions. Mines, steelworks, chemical plants, and engineering firms transformed landscapes once dominated by farms and smaller towns. Krupp became closely associated with heavy industry. Siemens expanded in electrical engineering. German chemical companies became international leaders in dyes, pharmaceuticals, and industrial chemistry. The connection between science and industry was especially important. Universities and technical institutes trained specialists. Research laboratories produced discoveries that firms could turn into new products and processes. Education was not separate from industrial growth. It became part of the machinery behind it. Now shift the view from the national economy to an ordinary city street. Berlin grew from a Prussian capital into one of Europe's largest cities. Hamburg expanded as a global port. Munich, Cologne, Leipzig, Dresden, Essen, and other urban centers drew workers and investment. Millions of people left rural communities for industrial towns. The move could mean higher wages and new possibilities. It could also mean crowded housing, pollution, insecure work, and a daily rhythm set by the factory clock rather than the agricultural season. That change created a new political mass, the urban working class. The social democratic movement grew despite Bismarck's attempts to restrict it. Trade unions organized workers. Catholic political organizations defended their communities. Liberals, conservatives, regional parties, and nationalists competed in Reichstag elections. So the empire was politically active, but its constitutional structure still placed executive power mainly in the monarchy and chancellorship. Elections mattered, yet they did not make the government fully parliamentary. This tension is easy to miss when the period is described only as an age of growth. Germany was becoming modern very quickly, but different parts of its political system were modernizing at different speeds. After Bismarck's dismissal, Wilhelm II wanted Germany to play a more visible role in world affairs. The empire acquired colonies in Africa and the Pacific, although its overseas empire remained smaller than those of Britain and France. Naval expansion became the most visible symbol of that policy. Admiral Alfred von Tirpitz supported construction of a powerful battle fleet. German leaders argued that a major industrial and trading nation needed naval strength. Britain saw the issue differently. British security depended heavily on naval superiority, and a large German fleet based close to the North Sea looked like a direct strategic challenge. The resulting naval competition made relations between the two countries more difficult. Meanwhile, the European alliance system was changing. Germany remained allied with Austria, Hungary and Italy in the Triple Alliance. France, which Bismarck had tried to isolate, formed an alliance with Russia. Britain later settled important disputes with France and Russia, producing the alignment usually called the Triple Entente. Europe was not divided into two perfectly rigid camps. Diplomacy still had room to move, but the structure was becoming more dangerous, especially for Germany. Look at the map. France lay to the west. Russia lay to the east. German military planners worried about a future war on two fronts. Their solution depended on speed. The best-known plan, associated with Alfred von Schlieffen, assumed that France had to be defeated quickly before Russia could bring its full strength to bear. The operational design depended on moving German forces through Belgium. That meant a military timetable had diplomatic consequences built into it. Once mobilization began, strategy left less room for political improvisation. At home, confidence and anxiety grew together. German goods competed around the world. Cities built railway stations, museums, universities, factories, and grand public buildings. A growing middle class participated in a wider consumer culture. At the same time, the Social Democrats became the largest party in the Reichstag. Conservatives feared socialism. The military and aristocratic establishment retained enormous influence. Reformers wanted the political system to become more parliamentary. The empire also had to create a sense of national identity across real differences. Bavarians, Prussians, Saxons, Catholics, Protestants, industrial workers, aristocrats, and urban professionals did not experience German unity in the same way. National institutions helped bind them together, but they did not erase regional and social conflict. Then, the international situation became more unstable. Crises in Morocco deepened rivalry with France. The Balkans became a region where national movements and great power interests overlapped. Hungary struggled to manage its diverse empire. Russia sought influence among Slavic peoples. Serbia pursued its own national ambitions. Germany's closest major ally, Austria-Hungary, increasingly feared that its position was weakening. In June 1914, Archduke Franz Ferdinand was assassinated in Sarajevo. It is tempting to treat the assassination as the moment war became inevitable. It was not. The next weeks mattered because governments still had choices. Austria-Hungary decided to confront Serbia. Germany offered strong support to Vienna. Russia mobilized in defense of its interests. France stood beside Russia. German planners viewed Russian mobilization through the logic of the two-front war. Diplomatic space narrowed as military schedules took over. Germany declared war on Russia and France. German troops entered neutral Belgium as part of the plan to reach France quickly. Britain entered the war. A crisis that might have remained regional had become a European war, and a state that had spent 4 decades measuring its success through industry, science, and national power was about to discover how destructive those same modern capacities could become when turned toward total war. When war began in August 1914, reactions across Germany were mixed. The famous photographs of cheering crowds were real, but they were not the whole country. Alongside excitement and patriotic enthusiasm were fear, uncertainty, and families who understood immediately what mobilization meant: separation, danger, and an unknown length of absence. German strategy in the West depended on speed. France had to be defeated before Russia could fully mobilize. German forces advanced through Belgium, but French and British armies halted them near the Marne. Then the Western Front hardened. Trenches, barbed wire, artillery positions, and fortified zones stretched across northern France and Belgium. Industrial technology made defense extremely strong and attack terribly expensive. Machine guns, heavy artillery, chemical weapons, aircraft, railways, and modern communications could support armies of millions. They could not easily produce a clean breakthrough. Germany also fought Russia in the east, where the front remained more mobile. German commanders won important victories, including Tannenberg. Hungary had greater difficulty. The Central Powers held large territories, but their opponents possessed enormous combined resources. That difference would matter more with every passing year. Britain's naval blockade restricted German access to overseas trade. Food, fertilizer, and raw materials became harder to obtain. The civilian economy was reorganized around war production. Shortages grew. The home front can be seen in small things: a queue, a ration, a delayed letter from a soldier, a household adjusting again to what is no longer available. Prices rose. Poor harvests and distribution problems made food insecurity worse. The winter of 1916 to 1917 became especially difficult, and was remembered for reliance on turnips when other food was scarce. Women entered forms of work previously dominated by men. Factories expanded arms production. Government agencies tried to control labor and raw materials. Letters between soldiers and families carried news that was often delayed or censored. Germany also turned to unrestricted submarine warfare in an effort to weaken Britain. Submarines could attack merchant shipping, but the strategy carried a political risk. Neutral powers could be drawn into the war. In 1917, the United States entered. That same year, revolution in Russia changed the Eastern Front. The Bolshevik government eventually withdrew from the conflict, allowing Germany to shift troops west. For a brief moment, German commanders saw an opening. In the spring of 1918, they launched major offensives on the Western Front and advanced farther than they had in years. But the attacks did not produce the decisive victory they needed. Casualties were heavy, supply problems grew. The army could not sustain the momentum. At the same time, American forces were arriving in greater numbers. By late summer and autumn, the military balance had shifted decisively. Germany's allies began to collapse. Bulgaria sought an armistice. The Ottoman Empire and Austria, Hungary followed. Inside Germany, exhaustion had become political. Workers protested hardship. Soldiers questioned whether the war could still be won. The government knew the military situation was deteriorating quickly. In October, constitutional reforms were introduced in an effort to create a more parliamentary system and improve the chances of obtaining peace terms. The change came too late to rescue the monarchy. At Kiel, sailors resisted orders for a final naval operation that many believed served no useful purpose. The mutiny spread. Workers' and soldiers' councils appeared in cities across Germany. Political authority began to unravel. On the 9th of November 1918, the abdication of Kaiser Wilhelm II was announced. A German Republic was proclaimed in Berlin. 2 days later, an armistice ended the fighting on the Western Front. The German Empire had lasted less than half a century, but the end of war did not produce a clean political beginning. Millions of soldiers returned to a country facing shortages, unrest, and uncertainty. The monarchy was gone. There was no agreement about what should replace it. Some Germans saw parliamentary democracy as a chance to rebuild. Others blamed the civilian politicians who had accepted the armistice. Here the gap between battlefield reality and political memory became dangerous, because much of Germany itself had not been occupied by enemy armies. A false claim spread that the army had not really been defeated, but had been betrayed by politicians, socialists, or other supposed enemies at home. The story became known as the stab-in, the back myth. It ignored the military position of late 1918, but it proved politically useful to opponents of the new republic. Then came the peace settlement. The Treaty of Versailles imposed territorial losses, military restrictions, reparations, and a clause assigning responsibility for the war to Germany and its allies. Alsace, Lorraine returned to France. Other territories were transferred or placed under international arrangements. The German army was sharply limited. Overseas colonies were lost. German leaders protested the terms but had little power to reject them. Versailles became more than a treaty. It became a symbol around which enemies of the new political order could organize. The Republic had not started the war. It had inherited the defeat, the treaty, the returning soldiers, the economic strain, and the argument over who was to blame. Its constitution would be written in Weimar. Its survival would depend on whether democratic institutions could carry burdens that had already broken an empire. The Weimar Republic began under conditions that would have strained almost any political system. Germany had lost a world war. The monarchy had collapsed. Soldiers were returning to an economy already weakened by shortages and demobilization. Revolutionary groups on the left wanted deeper social change. Nationalists on the right rejected both defeat and parliamentary democracy. The new government had to establish order without simply rebuilding the authoritarian system that had fallen. Its constitution was ambitious. Men and women received voting rights. The Reichstag was elected through proportional representation. Civil liberties were formally protected. A president served as head of state, and a chancellor and cabinet governed with parliamentary support. On paper, this was the most democratic national system Germany had yet created. But the constitution also contained pressure points. Proportional representation allowed a wide range of parties into parliament, which made stable coalitions difficult. The president held emergency powers under Article 48. Those powers were intended for moments when ordinary government broke down. Later, they would become part of the problem. The first years were violent. Left-wing revolutionary movements, including the Spartacist uprising, were suppressed. Right-wing paramilitary groups challenged the Republic as well. In 1920, the Kapp Putsch briefly drove the government out of Berlin before a general strike helped to defeat it. Political violence entered public life. Foreign Minister Walther Rathenau and other figures were assassinated. Paramilitary organizations offered veterans and younger men a political identity built around uniforms, marches, and confrontation. Then economic crisis moved from serious to surreal. Germany faced reparations under the Treaty of Versailles. In 1923, after disputes over payment, French and Belgian forces occupied the Ruhr. The German government encouraged passive resistance and continued paying workers who refused to cooperate. To meet those costs, the state printed enormous quantities of money. Inflation became hyperinflation. A bundle of banknotes could look impressive and still buy very little. Prices rose so fast that wages could lose much of their value within hours. Savings built over a lifetime could disappear. People with fixed incomes suffered badly, while some debtors benefited. The damage was economic, but it was also psychological. Contracts, savings, wages, and currency are all forms of trust. When money stopped holding value, confidence in institutions weakened with it. This is one reason the later collapse of Weimar can seem inevitable in hindsight. It was not. The Republic stabilized. Gustav Stresemann, briefly Chancellor and later Foreign Minister, helped guide the recovery. A new currency, the Rentenmark, ended hyperinflation. International agreements, including the Dawes Plan, restructured reparations and encouraged foreign investment. The middle years of the 1920s became noticeably calmer. Industry recovered. Berlin became famous for theatre, film, architecture, publishing, and modern culture. The Bauhaus connected art, architecture, craft, and industrial design. Germany's international position improved as well. The Locarno agreements eased tensions with Western neighbours. Germany entered the League of Nations. Stresemann pursued revision of the post-war settlement through negotiation rather than confrontation. That period matters because it complicates the story. Weimar was not a republic that simply collapsed from the moment it was born. It had a phase in which stabilization appeared possible. The political divisions, however, never disappeared. Conservative nationalists continued to reject the republic. Communists still wanted a revolutionary alternative. The National Socialist German Workers' Party, led by Adolf Hitler, remained small through much of the mid-1920s, but it had already shown its willingness to attack the political system. In 1923, Hitler and supporters attempted a coup in Munich, the Beer Hall Putsch. It failed. Hitler was imprisoned. After his release, the Nazi movement changed tactics. It increasingly pursued power through elections, while maintaining a paramilitary presence and an ideology built around nationalism, dictatorship, and racial exclusion. Then the economic foundation under Weimar shifted again. After the financial collapse in the United States, in 1929, international credit contracted. Germany had depended heavily on foreign loans and investment. Banks and businesses came under pressure. Factories closed. Unemployment rose into the millions. Families lost income and homes. Political parties that supported parliamentary governments struggled to agree on a response. Governments relied more often on presidential emergency decrees instead of stable Reichstag majorities. Extremist parties benefited. Communists attracted voters who believed capitalism and parliamentary democracy had failed. The Nazis built a different, overlapping coalition: unemployed workers, lower middle class voters, nationalists, people frightened by communism, and people angry about Versailles and political instability. Hitler promised jobs, national revival, unity, military strength, and the destruction of the political system he blamed for Germany's weakness. His movement also carried an extreme racial ideology. Anti-Semitism was not an accessory added later, it was central. Jews were falsely blamed for defeat, economic problems, cultural change, and political conflict. Now comes a point that is often blurred in simplified accounts. The Nazis never won a majority of all votes in a free national election. By 1932, however, they had become the largest party in the Reichstag. Conservative elites believed they could use Hitler's mass support while surrounding him with traditional politicians who would control him. On the 30th of January, 1933, President Paul von Hindenburg appointed Hitler Chancellor. He entered office through the legal machinery of the Republic. What happened next was the rapid destruction of that machinery from within. Hitler became Chancellor in January 1933, but appointment was not the same thing as total control. Germany still had a president, a parliament, political parties, courts, newspapers, trade unions, state governments, and institutions that did not yet belong entirely to the Nazi movement. The dictatorship was built by dismantling those limits one after another. After the Reichstag fire in February 1933, emergency measures suspended important civil liberties. Police powers expanded. Political opponents, especially communists, were arrested in large numbers. The Enabling Act then allowed Hitler's government to make laws without normal parliamentary approval. The remaining political space narrowed quickly. Other parties were banned or dissolved. Trade unions were replaced by Nazi-controlled organizations. State governments lost independence. The civil service, schools, cultural institutions, and professional organizations were brought into line with the regime. This process is often described with the German term Gleichschaltung, coordination. The word sounds administrative. The reality was political control backed by coercion. Violence was present from the beginning. The Nazi movement relied on organizations such as the SAA and SS, while new concentration camps held political prisoners and other people targeted by the regime. After President Hindenburg died in 1934, Hitler combined the highest offices of the state and became Führer. The regime also worked to create consent. Propaganda presented dictatorship as national renewal after the instability of Weimar. Public ceremonies, radio, youth organizations, schools, and mass political events carried Nazi messages into everyday life. But the national community promised by the regime was defined by exclusion. Anti-Semitism became state policy. Jewish Germans were pushed out of public employment and professions. The Nuremberg Laws of 1935 stripped Jews of citizenship rights and prohibited marriage between Jews and people classified as German or related blood. Discrimination moved through ordinary life, schools, businesses, property, work, marriage, and public space. In November 1938, the violence escalated during the pogrom known as Kristallnacht. Synagogues were burned, Jewish businesses were destroyed, people were attacked, and thousands of Jewish men were arrested and sent to concentration camps. By then, exclusion was moving toward more radical persecution. At the same time, Nazi economic and military policy appeared to many Germans to reverse the humiliation of the Depression. Public works expanded. Rearmament increased industrial demand. Conscription returned. Unemployment fell. The recovery helped the regime build support, but it rested increasingly on military spending, political coercion, and the removal of persecuted groups from economic life. Foreign policy followed the same pattern of testing limits and then moving farther. Germany left the League of Nations. It rebuilt armed forces beyond treaty restrictions and remilitarized the Rhineland. Britain and France, deeply marked by the memory of the First World War, responded cautiously. In 1938, Germany annexed Austria. Later that year, the Munich Agreement allowed Germany to take the Sudetenland from Czechoslovakia after Hitler claimed to be defending German-speaking populations there. Then, in 1939, German forces occupied the remaining Czech lands. That step changed the evidence. Nazi expansion could no longer be explained simply as an attempt to bring German-speaking populations into one state. Poland became the next target. Germany and the Soviet Union signed a non-aggression agreement that included secret arrangements dividing influence in Eastern Europe. On the 1st of September 1939, Germany invaded Poland. Britain and France declared war. The Second World War had begun in Europe. German forces won rapid victories in the opening phase. Poland was defeated. Denmark and Norway were occupied. In 1940, German armies attacked through the Low Countries and defeated France with a speed that surprised much of Europe. Britain continued the war. The German air campaign failed to force Britain into a settlement or create the conditions for invasion. In 1941, Hitler launched a vast invasion of the Soviet Union. The war in the East was not conceived by Nazi leaders as an ordinary military campaign. It was an ideological and racial war. Occupation policies were extraordinarily brutal. Civilians were subjected to forced labor, starvation, mass shootings, and other forms of terror. The persecution of Europe's Jews developed into systematic mass murder. German authorities and their collaborators deported Jewish communities from across occupied Europe to ghettos, killing sites, and extermination camps. At Auschwitz, Birkenau, Treblinka, Sobibor, and other sites, mass murder became organized policy. Approximately 6 million Jews were murdered in the Holocaust. Millions of other victims also died under Nazi persecution and occupation, including Roma, Soviet prisoners of war, people with disabilities, Polish civilians, political prisoners, and many others. These crimes were not separate from the war. They developed through the same structures of occupation, police power, transport, forced labor, racial policy, and conquest. While the machinery of persecution expanded, Germany's military position began to deteriorate. The invasion of the Soviet Union did not produce the rapid victory Hitler expected. German forces advanced deep into Soviet territory, but distance, resistance, supply problems, and the enormous resources of the Soviet state changed the balance. Stalingrad became a major turning point. A large German army was surrounded and surrendered in early 1943. In the West, Britain and the United States expanded strategic bombing against German cities and industry. Hamburg, Cologne, Dresden, Berlin, and many other urban areas suffered severe destruction. Civilians lived with air raids, displacement, and growing shortages. In June 1944, Allied forces landed in Normandy. Germany now faced large offensives from west and east. Some Germans resisted the regime, though resistance was fragmented and dangerous. The White Rose student movement distributed anti-Nazi leaflets before its members were arrested and executed. Conservative officers and civilians organized the 20th of July, 1944 attempt to kill Hitler and overthrow the government. The assassination attempt failed. The regime answered with arrests and executions. By 1945, defeat was unavoidable. Soviet armies advanced from the east. American, British, and other Allied forces moved from the west. Cities lay in ruins. Millions of refugees moved westward. Military units collapsed. Hitler remained in Berlin until the final days and died by suicide in April 1945. Germany surrendered unconditionally in May. The war in Europe was over. The Nazi state had brought destruction across the continent and ended with Germany itself occupied and devastated. The country that emerged from 1945 would not simply restore the old order. It would be divided among the victorious powers, subjected to legal judgment, and forced to confront crimes committed under the dictatorship. And before long, the conflict between the former allies would divide Germany again. In May 1945, Germany was no longer a sovereign state. The United States, Soviet Union, Britain, and France divided the country into 4 occupation zones. Berlin, although deep inside the Soviet zone, was divided among the same 4 powers. The occupation program was described through broad goals: demilitarization, denazification, democratization, and decentralization. The armed forces were dissolved. Nazi organizations were banned. Officials associated with the dictatorship were removed from positions of authority to varying degrees. The Nuremberg trials became the most visible attempt to establish legal responsibility for the crimes of the Nazi state. Leading figures were prosecuted for crimes against peace, war crimes, and crimes against humanity. The proceedings helped establish the principle that individuals could be held internationally responsible for acts carried out under state authority. Outside the courtroom, daily life remained difficult. Cities had been badly damaged. Transport networks were broken. Housing was scarce. Refugees, displaced people, former prisoners, returning soldiers, and German populations fleeing or expelled from territories farther east moved through Central Europe. Reconstruction had barely begun when the alliance that had defeated Hitler started to fracture. The Western powers increasingly favored economic recovery and democratic institutions in their zones. The Soviet Union sought security, reparations, and a political system aligned with socialism. Germany became one of the places where the emerging Cold War took physical form. A new currency, the Deutsche Mark, was introduced in the Western zones in 1948. Soviet authorities responded by blocking land routes into West Berlin. That created an unusual crisis. A Western-controlled city, surrounded by Soviet-controlled territory, had to be supplied from the air. The Western powers organized the Berlin airlift and kept the city supplied by aircraft for many months until the blockade was lifted. The immediate crisis ended. The political division did not. In 1949, the Western occupation zones became the Federal Republic of Germany, usually called West Germany, with Bonn as its capital. Later that year, the Soviet zone became the German Democratic Republic, or East Germany, with its political center in East Berlin. Germany now existed as two states. West Germany developed as a federal parliamentary democracy under the Basic Law. Its first chancellor, Konrad Adenauer, tied the new republic closely to Western Europe and the United States. Economic recovery was rapid. The social market economy combined private enterprise with social protections. While factories reopened, exports grew, housing was rebuilt, and living standards rose. The Federal Republic also joined institutions that connected it to former enemies, especially France. European cooperation and membership in NATO anchored West Germany in the Western system. East Germany followed a different path. The Socialist Unity Party dominated political life. Industry came under state control. Agriculture was reorganized, and central planning directed the economy. The government described itself as an anti-fascist socialist state. While political dissent was closely monitored, the Ministry for State Security, the Stasi, built an extensive surveillance system. The two German states still shared language, memory, and families. Politically, they now belonged to opposing worlds. The border between them was about to become much harder to cross. Two German states did not immediately mean a completely sealed border. Berlin remained the most important opening. Because the city itself was divided, people in East Germany could often travel to East Berlin and then cross into the western sectors. During the 1950s, hundreds of thousands used that route. Many were young and educated, and their departure created serious economic and political problems for the East German government. The state faced a blunt choice. It could make life attractive enough to stop people leaving, or it could make leaving much harder. In August 1961, East German authorities, with Soviet approval, closed the border in Berlin. Barbed wire appeared across streets and rail lines. It was gradually replaced by a more elaborate system of concrete walls, guard towers, restricted zones, and barriers. The Berlin Wall became the clearest physical symbol of Germany's division. The wall changed ordinary geography overnight. Families were separated. Commuting routes ended. Attempts to escape became dangerous, and some people were killed trying to cross. On either side, German society continued to develop in different directions. West Germany remained prosperous and politically stable. Democratic institutions became more deeply rooted. A younger generation began asking harder questions about the Nazi past and about the roles played by parents, teachers, judges, officials, and other adults during the dictatorship. Universities expanded. Protest movements challenged traditional authority. Immigration also changed the country. Workers recruited from countries, including Turkey, came to support the growing economy, and many families eventually made Germany their permanent home. East Germany built its own social institutions. The state provided employment, education, housing programs, and extensive participation of women in the workforce. At the same time, it maintained censorship, travel restrictions, and political control. The Stasi collected information through officials and a large network of informants. For many people, everyday life could contain both social stability and the knowledge that political boundaries were closely enforced. From the late 1960s, West German leaders began trying to reduce the temperature of the division. Willy Brandt's Ostpolitik accepted the practical existence of East Germany while seeking more contact across the border. Agreements improved travel and communication, and both German states later entered the United Nations. The war remained. By the 1980s, however, the political world around it was changing. East Germany faced economic difficulties, debt, aging infrastructure, shortages, and increasingly visible environmental damage. Many citizens wanted greater freedom to travel and speak openly. At the same time, Soviet leader Mikhail Gorbachev introduced reforms and signaled less willingness to use force simply to preserve every communist government in Eastern Europe. In 1989, Hungary began opening its border with Austria. East Germans travelling through Hungary found a new route west. At home, churches became places where groups could meet. In Leipzig, prayers for peace at St. Nicholas Church developed into recurring demonstrations. That is why the fall of the Berlin Wall did not really begin at the wall. It began with pressure building in several places at once: travel, economics, churches, demonstrations, and a changing Soviet policy. Crowds called for reform, freedom of movement, and political rights. Wir sind das Volk, we are the people, expressed a direct claim that citizens, not the ruling party, should determine the future of the state. The East German leadership hesitated. Erich Honecker was removed. Protests continued. On the 9th of November 1989, an East German official gave a confused announcement about new travel regulations. Television carried the statement across the country. People gathered at Berlin border crossings. Guards did not have clear instructions for handling the growing crowds. Eventually, the crossings opened. Berliners moved through the barrier that had divided the city for 28 years. People climbed onto the wall, crossed between east and west, and embraced. The wall itself was still standing in many places. Its political purpose was not. The opening of the Berlin Wall changed the question almost immediately. Before November 1989, the central issue was how East Germany might reform. After the border opened, another possibility moved to the centre: could the two German states become one again? Not everyone began with the same answer. Some East German reformers imagined building a more democratic version of their own state. But political and economic conditions moved quickly. The Socialist Unity Party lost control. New political organisations appeared. Free elections produced strong support for parties favouring reunification. Even then, unity could not be decided by Germans alone. The four victorious powers of the Second World War still held special legal rights concerning Germany. Negotiations therefore involved East Germany, West Germany, the United States, the Soviet Union, Britain, and France. Security was one of the hardest questions. A united Germany would be much larger and more powerful than either German state on its own. Would it remain in NATO? What would that mean for the Soviet Union and the European balance? The negotiations eventually produced agreement. On the 3rd of October 1990, East Germany joined the Federal Republic under the constitutional framework of the Basic Law. Germany was united again. Legally, the change was fast. Socially and economically, it could not be. The two states had spent more than 40 years under different economic systems, institutions, workplaces, schools, political cultures, and patterns of daily life. Reunification removed the border. It did not make those differences disappear on the same day. Eastern state-owned industries suddenly faced Western and international competition. Many factories closed or were privatized. Unemployment rose, and large numbers of people moved west in search of work. The federal government invested heavily in eastern infrastructure. Roads, railways, communications networks, towns, and utilities were modernized. Even so, differences in employment, wealth, demography, and political experience persisted. That is the first important correction to the celebratory image of reunification. The wall could fall in a night. Integration was a much longer process. Berlin changed again as well. The city became the national capital. and Parliament and the federal government gradually returned there. Germany's wider position in Europe also mattered. The post-war Federal Republic had built its security and legitimacy through cooperation, especially with France, Western Europe, and the United States. Reunified Germany continued that path inside the European Union and the Atlantic Alliance. The country became Europe's largest economy and one of its most influential political actors. Helmut Kohl, who had overseen reunification, remained Chancellor through the difficult early years of integration. Gerhard Schröder later introduced economic reforms intended to improve competitiveness and address unemployment. Angela Merkel, Germany's first female Chancellor, became one of Europe's most influential leaders. Her governments faced financial crises, migration debates, environmental policy, European integration, and repeated international challenges. Her style also reinforced a post-war German preference for caution, coalition, building, and stability in foreign affairs. Domestic society continued to change. Immigration made Germany more diverse. Communities with roots in Turkey, Eastern Europe, the Middle East, Africa, and many other regions became part of everyday German life. The older assumption that Germany could be understood mainly through one ethnic or regional identity became harder to sustain. An aging population created new pressures on employment, pensions, and the welfare state. Technology changed industries and work. Environmental policy became a major political issue. Germany invested heavily in renewable energy and committed itself to reducing dependence on nuclear power and fossil fuels. While debates continued over cost, industrial competitiveness, and energy security, the party system also became more fragmented. Newer parties challenged older coalitions from both left and right, and through all of this, the 20th century remained unusually present in public life. Memorials, museums, schools, archives, and public institutions continued to confront the Holocaust and the Nazi dictatorship. The purpose was not to make the past easier to live with. It was to prevent familiarity from turning into forgetfulness. The division of Germany became another layer of public memory. Former border installations, Stasi records, museums, and personal testimony preserved the experience of living in two states. Modern Germany therefore carries several histories at the same time. Its federal structure still reflects the long importance of regional states. Its European policy is shaped by the memory of what happened when national power was pursued through domination. Its debates over East and West still carry traces of more than 40 years of division. Reunification solved the constitutional question of whether there would be one Germany or two. It did not solve every social question created by the separation. And perhaps that is the most consistent theme in this long history. Political settlements can close one argument while leaving the conditions for another one already in place. Germany's history does not form a straight road toward the present. The Germanic tribes did not know they were beginning a national story. Charlemagne did not rule a German nation, state. The Holy Roman Emperors governed through princes, bishops, cities, monasteries, and local rights that they could never simply erase. The Reformation deepened those divisions. The 30 Years' War strengthened territorial rulers. Austria and Prussia then competed for leadership until Napoleon dismantled the old imperial framework. 19th century nationalism kept asking for unity, and Bismarck finally created it under Prussian power. That empire became an industrial and scientific giant, then collapsed in the First World War. The Weimar Republic tried to build democracy while carrying defeat, political violence, economic crisis, and a peace settlement that many Germans rejected. Its failure opened the way to a dictatorship that brought persecution, genocide, and war on a scale that devastated Europe and Germany itself. After 1945, there was no return to the old state. Occupation became division. Two German republics existed for more than 4 decades. The wall that came to symbolize that division opened in 1989, and reunification followed in 1990. Today, those layers are still visible. They are in the federal states and regional identities. They are in old city centers, rebuilt streets, industrial regions, churches, memorials, former border installations, and the course of the Rhine. They are also present in political habits, suspicion of concentrated power. The importance of federalism, the weight given to European cooperation, and the continuing public examination of dictatorship and war. Unification is one thread in the story, but it is not the only one. Another thread is the repeated problem of managing difference. Different rulers, confessions, regions, classes, political systems, and memories. German history repeatedly shows institutions trying to contain those differences, sometimes successfully, sometimes catastrophically. That is why the map can be misleading. A clean border tells you where a state is now. It does not tell you how many older political worlds are still layered underneath it. Thank you for spending this time with me here at Lamplight and Historian. I am Charles. And if you look again at an old road, a river crossing, a ruined wall, a rebuilt city centre, or a familiar name on a map, you may be looking at more than one Germany at once.